The taxi dropped me off in front of my house at exactly 2 a.m., 3 months after I'd left for my recovery trip through Europe. I hadn't told David I was coming home early. Something about my son's recent phone conversations had felt off, evasive in a way that made my instincts prickle. I wanted to see our household dynamics without advance warning. The stroke 6 months ago had changed everything. One moment I was reviewing property contracts in my home office. The next, I was waking up in a hospital bed. My left side partially paralyzed and my speech slurred beyond recognition. The doctors said I was lucky. Many people my age didn't survive strokes as severe as mine, and those who did often face permanent disabilities requiring full-time care. But I had Kaza. My daughter-in-law moved into my house the day I came home from the hospital, sleeping in the guest room next to mine so she could help me navigate tasks that had suddenly become monumental. Feeding myself, getting dressed, walking to the bathroom without falling. Kaza assisted with everything patiently, quietly, all while working 2 part-time jobs to keep money coming in. David had been helpful too, of course, but in the distracted way of someone managing a crisis rather than actually caring for someone. He handled medical appointments and insurance paperwork, while Kaza carried the intimate, exhausting daily work of helping me rebuild basic functions. When my doctor suggested travel might aid my recovery, new environments to challenge my healing brain, David had enthusiastically supported the idea. "Mom, you should take as long as you need in Europe. Kaza and I will handle everything here." Now, standing in my driveway with my luggage, I realized how quiet the house looked. No lights in the main windows. No signs of activity that suggested my son and daughter-in-law were living comfortably in my absence. I let myself in with my key, immediately noting that the living room felt different, emptier. Somehow, as if furniture had been rearranged or removed. The air carried a slightly stale quality, the unmistakable smell of a house that hadn't been properly maintained, despite the detailed instructions I'd left about utilities, maintenance, and upkeep. "David? Kaza?" I called softly, not wanting to startle them if they were asleep. No response from upstairs where their bedroom was located. Instead, I heard a rustling sound, quiet movement coming from the direction of the garage. Confused, I walked through the kitchen toward the door leading to the attached garage. There was nothing in that space that required attention at 2 in the morning. It housed my car, storage shelves, and the washer and dryer. When I opened the door and turned on the light, I froze. Kaza was sleeping on a thin camping mattress laid directly on the concrete floor, covered by a single blanket that looked woefully inadequate for the October chill. Her belongings were organized neatly in one corner, clothes folded into small piles, toiletries arranged on a cardboard box that served as a makeshift dresser. "Kaza," I whispered, shocked. "What are you doing?" She woke instantly, the alert, defensive kind of awakening that suggested she'd grown accustomed to being startled awake. When she saw me, her face shifted from confusion to recognition, and then to something that looked painfully like shame. "Victoria, you're home early," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I was just..." She gestured vaguely at her sleeping arrangement, as if trying to explain why she was living like a refugee in my garage. "Kaza," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Why are you sleeping out here? Where's David?" "He's upstairs," she replied. "In your bedroom. He said I make too much noise and complain too much, so it's better for everyone if I sleep here." Something cold settled in my chest. "How long?" I asked. "Since maybe 6 weeks after you left for Europe," she said carefully. "David said the guest room should stay nice for when you return, and that the main bedroom is more comfortable for him. He said you agreed." Her expression made it painfully clear that her agreement hadn't mattered. "I work early mornings at the coffee shop and late shifts at the restaurant," she added softly. "David said my schedule disrupts his sleep. He said it would be better for the marriage if we slept separately." I looked around the garage again, really seeing it this time. The small reading lamp, the plastic container that likely held snacks, clothes hanging from a makeshift line strung between shelves. This wasn't temporary. This was how she had been living. "Where is David right now?" I asked. "Sleeping in your bed," she said. He said, "Since you're gone, someone should use the good bedroom instead of wasting it." I walked back through the house and into my bedroom. David was sprawled across my king-sized bed, surrounded by empty food containers and piles of laundry that looked days old. The room smelled stale and unclean, like someone who'd been living without regard for the space, or the people connected to it. David. He woke slowly, groggy, the heavy awakening of someone who'd stayed up too late or been drinking. When he focused on me standing in the doorway, his expression shifted from confusion to mild annoyance. Mom? You're supposed to be in Europe another month. I came home early, I said. Why is Kaza sleeping in the garage? He sat up and stretched, as if this were a minor inconvenience. She's been complaining a lot and creating drama, he said. I figured it would be better for everyone if she had her own space where she couldn't bother anyone. You figured it would be better to make your wife sleep on a concrete floor? It's not that dramatic, he said dismissively. She has a mattress and blankets. And honestly, she works weird hours anyway. So it makes sense for her to sleep separately. I stared at my son, this 32-year-old man, who was casually justifying his behavior as if it were a reasonable household management decision. Get out of my bed and get dressed, I said. We need to talk. Mom, you look tired from traveling, he said. We can discuss this tomorrow. No, I said. We're discussing this right now. And then you're going to explain why you think treating Kaza like an unwelcome guest is acceptable behavior for a married man living in his mother's house. As David reluctantly got up, something became clear to me. My 3 months in Europe had given me more than physical recovery. They had given me clarity about family dynamics I'd been too vulnerable to confront during my immediate recovery. David had taken advantage of my absence and Kaza's gentle nature to create a hierarchy based on entitlement rather than decency. But he didn't know something important. My recovery had included more than physical therapy. I had spent 3 months thinking about inheritance, loyalty, and what people deserved based on their actions, not their accidents of birth. And some lessons about character come with consequences. Consequences that were about to reshape our family permanently. Some sons were about to discover that underestimating their mother's determination was a mistake, one that could cost them everything they had assumed they would inherit. I spent the rest of that sleepless night sitting in my living room, thinking about the 18 months since my stroke, and how differently David and Kasia had responded to my vulnerability. While I'd been in Europe focusing on my physical recovery, I'd also been reflecting on family relationships with the clarity that comes from distance and time. When the sun came up, I found Kasia in the kitchen making coffee with the careful quietness of someone accustomed to not disturbing others. She was already dressed for her morning shift at the coffee shop. Her movements were efficient but tired in a way that suggested months of inadequate sleep. Good morning, Victoria. I am sorry you found me in the garage last night. I should have explained the situation better. Kasia, you have nothing to apologize for, I said. I'm the one who should be apologizing for not knowing what was happening in my own house. She looked surprised by my response, clearly having expected criticism rather than support. David said you might be upset about the arrangement, she said carefully, but that you would understand once you heard the full story. What's David's version of the full story? Kasia sat down across from me with her coffee, her expression uncertain, as though she wasn't sure how honest she was allowed to be about my son's behavior. David said that while you were sick I became too, what was his word, presumptuous. That I acted like I belonged in the family instead of remembering my place as a foreign daughter-in-law. Anger flared in my chest as I realized David had been rewriting the history of my recovery to justify treating Kasia poorly. Kasia, I asked, what exactly did you do that David considered presumptuous? She hesitated. I think maybe I became too comfortable during your recovery. I slept in the guest room to help with your night medications. I used the kitchen to cook foods you could eat easily. I answered phone calls from doctors and physical therapists when you were too tired to talk. You mean you provided excellent care when I needed it most? She nodded. David said that after you left for Europe, I should remember this is his family home, where I am a guest, and that I needed to be more respectful of boundaries. I realized then that David had systematically undermined Kasia's confidence and sense of belonging during my absence, using my recovery period as evidence that she'd overstepped appropriate limits. Kasia, how has your life changed since I left for Europe? I work more hours now to help with house expenses. Coffee shop in the morning, restaurant at night. David said family finances are tight, and I need to contribute more. What family finances? David said your medical bills and recovery trip were very expensive, and that everyone needs to sacrifice to help the family through a difficult time. I felt stunned by David's manipulation. My medical insurance had covered the stroke treatment completely, and my European recovery trip had been paid for with my own savings. There were no financial pressures on our household that would require Kasia to work multiple jobs. Kasia, I asked quietly, has David been taking money from your jobs to help with household expenses? Yes, she said. I give him most of my paychecks to help with the mortgage and utilities. David said this is how American families work together during crisis. I realized then that David had been stealing Kasia's wages while forcing her to live in the garage, using fabricated financial stress to justify exploitation, behavior that would have been illegal if she were an employee rather than family. David appeared in the kitchen around 8 o'clock, looking like someone who had slept comfortably in a master bedroom while his wife slept on concrete. He kissed my cheek and sat down with the casual confidence of someone who assumed yesterday's conversation had been resolved in his favor. Mom, I'm glad you're feeling better. That Europe trip obviously did wonders for your recovery. Thank you, David. I had a lot of time to think about family relationships and what people deserve based on their actions. That's great, he said. Being away probably gave you perspective on how well Kasia and I managed everything while you were recovering. Actually, I replied, I'd like to understand exactly how you managed things. Kasia tells me she's been working 2 jobs to help with family finances. David's expression shifted slightly. He'd clearly realized I was asking specific questions, not making small talk. Well, you know how expensive everything has become. Medical costs, household maintenance, general living expenses. It made sense for everyone to contribute more during a difficult period. What medical costs? I asked. My insurance covered my stroke treatment, and I paid for my own recovery trip. There were additional expenses you probably don't remember because of the stroke, he said smoothly. Extra medications, special equipment, increased utilities from home care. He was lying confidently, clearly practiced. David, I said, I'd like to see documentation of the medical expenses that required Kasia to work multiple jobs. Mom, you don't need to worry about financial details while you're still recovering. I've been handling everything responsibly. I'm recovered enough to manage my own household finances, I replied. And I'm curious why managing them required making Kasia sleep in the garage. That wasn't about finances, he said quickly. That was about establishing appropriate boundaries for household harmony. Whose harmony? I asked. Because Kasia sleeping on concrete doesn't seem harmonious to me. His confidence cracked. Mom, I think you're getting upset about normal household adjustments that happen when family dynamics change. What I'm upset about, I said evenly, is discovering that you've been exploiting Kasia's labor while forcing her to live in conditions that would violate housing laws if she were a tenant rather than family. I haven't been exploiting anyone, he protested. I've been managing a difficult situation while you were away, establishing structure and responsibility that helps everyone contribute appropriately to family welfare. I looked at my son and noted how easily he rationalized cruelty as management and exploitation as responsibility. He had taken advantage of my absence and Kasia's vulnerable position to create a household dynamic that served his comfort while stripping her of dignity. David, I said, you and I need to have a private conversation about your understanding of family responsibility and property ownership. What do you mean? I mean, you've forgotten some important facts about whose house this is and what rights that gives you. For the first time since I'd arrived home, David looked uncertain about his place in our family hierarchy. Some sons needed to be reminded that assumptions about inheritance and authority could be revoked. And some mothers had spent 3 months in Europe not only recovering from strokes, but planning responses to disrespect that required decisive action. I asked Kasia to take the day off from both her jobs, explaining that we had important family business to discuss. She looked nervous about missing work, conditioned by months of David's pressure to believe her income was essential. Victoria, I cannot afford to miss shifts. David said we are behind on mortgage payments. Kasia, I said gently, trust me. Today is more important than your shifts, and there are no mortgage problems. After she reluctantly called her employers, I suggested we take a drive while David went to his office. I wanted to talk away from his influence, and I had specific places I wanted her to see. "Where are we going?" she asked as we got into my car. "I want to show you something that will help you understand our family situation more clearly." I drove first to Riverside Apartments, a well-maintained complex 10 minutes from my house. Kasia looked confused as I parked outside the management office. "Victoria, why are we here?" "Because I want you to meet Maria Santos, the property manager." "Maria, this is Kasia, my daughter-in-law. I've told you about Mrs. Sterling." "How wonderful to meet you," Maria said warmly. "Your mother-in-law owns this entire complex. She's been our landlord for 8 years. Kasia's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Victoria, you own these apartments?" "I own several properties, Kasia. This is one of them." We spent 20 minutes touring the complex while Maria explained rental income, maintenance schedules, and tenant satisfaction rates. Kasia listened quietly, still trying to understand why I was sharing this with her. Next, we visited Meadowbrook Shopping Center, where I own 3 commercial buildings. Then Pine Ridge Estates, where 6 rental houses provided steady monthly income. "Victoria," she finally said, "I do not understand. David said your medical bills cause financial problems for the family." "David lied to you," I said plainly. "I have no medical debt, no mortgage payments, and substantial monthly income. There has never been financial pressure that required you to work multiple jobs or live in my garage." She was silent, absorbing the truth that her suffering had been unnecessary, manufactured. "Why would David lie about money problems?" she asked softly. "Because it gave him an excuse to control your time, take your wages, and make you feel like a burden instead of valued family." "But if you have all these properties," she asked, "why does David not know?" "He knows some," I said. "He knows I own the house and have retirement savings. He does not know the full extent of my business interests because I never shared them." We stopped for lunch at a quiet cafe, where Kasia finally felt safe enough to ask the question that mattered most. "Victoria, David said that after your stroke, I became too familiar with household management and needed to remember my place as a foreigner in an American family." "Kasia," I asked, "what is your place in this family?" "I do not know anymore," she admitted. "David says I am a guest who should be grateful for permission to live here. But when you were sick, you treated me like a daughter." That anger rose again. "When I was recovering from my stroke," I asked, "what did you do for me?" "I helped with medications, physical therapy, exercises, cooking, cleaning, and driving you to appointments. I slept in the guest room in case you needed help at night." "And how did that make you feel?" "Like I was helping someone I love," she said. "Like I was useful. Like I was needed. Like I belonged in the family." "That was exactly how you should have felt because that's exactly what you were doing. David said I was taking advantage of your weakness to gain a position in the household I hadn't earned. David was wrong. Kasia, you earned your place in this family through love, loyalty, and sacrifice, especially when I needed care the most. What you didn't earn was sleeping in the garage or working multiple jobs to support a household that never needed your financial contribution in the first place." Over lunch, I explained more about my property investments and business background, helping Kaya understand that our family's finances were stable enough for everyone to live comfortably without demanding sacrifice from the most vulnerable person in the household. "Victoria," she asked carefully, "what does this mean for your marriage with David?" "That depends on what you want it to mean," I replied. "But I want you to know something very clearly. Regardless of what happens between David and me, you have a secure place in this family. You also have financial support to build whatever life will make you happy." She frowned slightly. "I don't understand." "I'm saying your future doesn't depend on David's approval or his treatment of you. You have options you didn't even know existed." On the drive home, Kasia was quiet for several minutes. Then she asked the question I'd been expecting. "Victoria, why are you showing me all of this?" "Why now?" "Because I spent 3 months in Europe thinking about family loyalty," I said. "And I realized the person who showed me the most genuine care during my most vulnerable time shouldn't be living in my garage, while my son enjoys comfort he hasn't earned." "What are you planning to do?" "I'm making changes. Changes in household management and property ownership. Changes that ensure people are treated according to how they treat others." Will David be angry? David will be furious. But his anger matters far less to me than your dignity and well-being. She hesitated. I don't want to cause problems between you and your son. Kezia, I said firmly. David caused those problems himself the moment he chose to mistreat you while living in my house and spending my money. I'm simply correcting them. That evening I asked David to meet me in my home office, the room where I kept files on every property and investment I owned. It was time for my son to understand exactly what he stood to lose. David, we need to discuss some changes I'm making to household arrangements and financial management. What kind of changes? The kind that teach consequences for treating people poorly when you have no independent power to enforce that treatment. Some sons needed dramatic lessons about authority, respect, and the difference between inheriting wealth and earning it. David was about to learn which category he belonged to. He sat across from my desk with casual confidence, the confidence of someone who assumed he understood the boundaries of the conversation. He'd spent months mistreating Kezia while living in my house, apparently believing that being my son gave him authority to establish whatever household hierarchy he pleased. Mom, I know you're upset about the garage situation, he said, waving it off. But you're overreacting. Kezia was perfectly comfortable. How would you know? I asked. Did you ask her before moving her out of the guest room? I made an executive decision while you were away. Someone had to maintain order. Whose order? I asked calmly. And whose authority? He looked irritated, as though the questions were unnecessarily philosophical. After all, he believed he'd been the head of household while I recovered in Europe. I opened the file cabinet beside my desk and pulled out a thick folder of property deeds, insurance policies, and financial documents, papers David had never seen. David, what? Do you know about my assets? He shrugged. You own this house. Some retirement savings. Life insurance. Pretty standard middle-class widow finances. What if I told you my standard finances include ownership of multiple properties generating substantial monthly income? He scoffed. I'd say your stroke might have affected your judgment. I laid the deeds across my desk. His expression shifted as he recognized addresses, apartment complexes, rental houses, commercial buildings throughout the county. I own 17 properties, I said evenly. They generate over $40,000 a month in rental income. I have investment portfolios worth more than $800,000. And this house is fully paid off. He picked up the papers, hands unsteady. Why didn't I know about this? Because you never asked, I said. And I saw no reason to discuss my business affairs with someone more interested in inheritance than family. This is a lot more than I realized. It raises questions about how you treated Kezia, I replied. What do you mean? I mean you forced your wife to work multiple jobs and sleep in the garage based on fictional financial pressures. You took her wages to address debts that didn't exist. You manipulated her immigration status and family position to justify behavior that amounts to abuse. I wasn't abusing anyone, he snapped. I was managing resources during a crisis. What crisis? I asked. Point to a real financial emergency that required her sacrifice. He said nothing. Taking wages under false pretenses is theft, I continued. Forcing someone to live in substandard conditions is psychological abuse. Using immigration vulnerability to control someone is exploitation. You're being dramatic, he said weakly. She was fine contributing more. What privileges did she assume that she hadn't earned? I asked. Living comfortably here. Having equal say. Acting like she belonged instead of remembering she married into this family. Our family home, I repeated. David, whose name is on this deed? Yours. And you live here because I allow it, I said calmly. You have no property rights. No authority over this household. No legal standing to control how others are treated. But I'm your heir. Inheritance is a gift, not a right. And gifts can be revoked. You wouldn't disinherit your own son. I might redirect assets to someone who's demonstrated loyalty and compassion instead of entitlement. His face drained of color. My stroke clarified my judgment, I said quietly. And I decided something very simple. The person who cared for me deserves security. The person who exploited that care deserves consequences. The next morning I called my attorney Robert Shen. "Victoria," he said warmly, "how was your recovery trip?" "Enlightening. I need to make major changes to my will." I explained everything. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "Courts scrutinize estate changes after medical events." "I've never been more certain. This decision is based on 18 months of observation, not illness." That afternoon I met Keisha at the cafe where she worked. "I'm transferring ownership of 3 apartment buildings to you," I told her. "They generate about $15,000 a month." She stared at me in disbelief. "This is too much." "This is recognition," I said. "For 18 months of care. What if David tries to fight this? He won't win. Your financial and immigration security will be protected." She whispered, "Why are you doing this?" "Because you did what caring people do," I answered. "And David did what selfish people do when they think no one is watching. Character matters more than blood relationships." That evening, I asked both David and Keisha to join me in the living room for a family meeting about household arrangements and future plans. David arrived visibly nervous, clearly having spent the day replaying our earlier conversation in his head. Keisha looked equally tense, bracing herself for conflict that could affect her marriage and her place in the household. "I've made some decisions about property ownership and family responsibilities that will affect everyone," I began. "Mom, before you say anything, I want to apologize for how I handled things while you were away. Maybe I was too strict about household management." "David, your apology is noted," I replied evenly. "But apologizing doesn't undo months of psychological abuse and financial exploitation." "I wasn't psychologically abusive. I was establishing structure." "David, you forced your wife to sleep in the garage while you slept in my bed. You stole her wages under false pretenses. You manipulated her immigration fears to control her behavior. That is textbook domestic abuse." "Mom, you're exaggerating." "Kaza," I said calmly, "tell David about your living conditions for the past 2 months." Kaza looked uncomfortable being asked to describe her own mistreatment, but she answered honestly. "I slept on camping mattress in garage. I worked 2 jobs and gave paychecks to David for family expenses. I ate meals alone because David said I complained too much during dinner." David's face flushed as he listened to her calm, factual account of treatment he had somehow convinced himself was reasonable. "That makes it sound worse than it was." Keisha agreed to these arrangements. "David," I asked quietly, "did Kaza have any real choice? Could she have refused without consequences? She could have discussed alternatives. While living in my house under the threat of homelessness if she didn't comply with your demands?" I interrupted. "David will be furious. But his anger matters far less to me than your dignity and well-being." She hesitated. "I don't want to cause problems between you and your son." "Keisha," I said firmly, "David caused those problems himself the moment he chose to mistreat you while living in my house and spending my money. I'm simply correcting them." That evening I asked David to meet me in my home office, the room where I kept files on every property and investment I owned. It was time for my son to understand exactly what he stood to lose. "David, we need to discuss some changes I'm making to household arrangements and financial management." "What kind of changes?" "The kind that teach consequences for treating people poorly when you have no independent power to enforce that treatment." Some sons needed dramatic lessons about authority, respect, and the difference between inheriting wealth and earning it. David was about to learn which category he belonged to. He sat across from my desk with casual confidence, the confidence of someone who assumed he understood the boundaries of the conversation. He'd spent months mistreating Keisha while living in my house, apparently believing that being my son gave him authority to establish whatever household hierarchy he pleased. "Mom, I know you're upset about the garage situation," he said, waving it off. "But you're overreacting. Keisha was perfectly comfortable." "How would you know?" I asked. "Did you ask her before moving her out of the guest room?" "I made an executive decision while you were away. Someone had to maintain order." "Whose order?" I asked calmly. "And whose authority?" He looked irritated, as though the questions were unnecessarily philosophical. After all, he believed he'd been the head of household while I recovered in Europe. I opened the file cabinet beside my desk and pulled out a thick folder of property deeds, insurance policies, and financial documents, papers David had never seen. David, what? Stealing their wages is not minor household management. It's domestic abuse. Kaza sat quietly, clutching her copies of the documents, her expression still stunned. Victoria, she said softly, this is too much responsibility. I don't know how to manage apartment buildings. You'll learn, I assured her. I'll teach you property management, tenant relations, and business operations. You're intelligent and responsible. You'll do well. But David, Kezia began, glancing at her husband with concern. David doesn't get a vote in how I distribute my assets, I said firmly. He's forgotten that inheritance is a privilege, not a right. David stood and began pacing the room, agitation radiating from him. Mom, this is obviously some psychological reaction to your stroke. You're not thinking clearly. My thinking is perfectly clear. I spent 3 months in Europe reflecting on loyalty and character. The person who cared for me when I was most vulnerable deserves security. I cared for you too, David protested. I handled appointments and insurance paperwork. You handled logistics, I replied. Kezia handled daily care. You managed the crisis. She managed the recovery. That doesn't justify giving her half of my inheritance. Your inheritance? I asked. What exactly have you done to earn one beyond being born? David stopped pacing, visibly confused by a question he'd never considered. I'm your son. Sons inherit. That's how families work. Some families work that way, I said. Others reward loyalty, character, and demonstrated care, not accidents of birth. You're setting a terrible precedent. It sends a clear message, I replied. People who abuse vulnerable family members lose privileges they assumed were automatic. Kaza finally spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. David, I think Victoria's right about consequences. You treated me very badly while she was away. You used lies about money to justify it. I wasn't treating you. That evening, after David left the house to think things through at a friend's apartment, Kezia and I had dinner together for the first time since my return from Europe. Victoria, she said quietly, I'm afraid of what this will do to my marriage. David is very angry. Kezia, I replied. What do you want your marriage to become? Do you want to keep living with someone who believes you deserve to sleep in a garage and have your wages taken from you? I want a marriage built on respect and partnership, she said. But I don't know if David can change his ideas about my place in the family. David's ideas about your place in the family have already been corrected through legal documentation, I said calmly. You are now an independent property owner with substantial income. He can't control your finances or your living conditions anymore. But he can choose to be resentful and make life difficult. I leaned forward. Kezia, you have options now. You can afford to live independently if David cannot accept treating you as an equal partner. You're no longer trapped by immigration status or financial dependence. As we talked about Kezia's new financial independence and property management responsibilities, I realized that the most important outcome wasn't punishing David. It was making sure Kezia understood her own value, and that she had the power to demand respectful treatment. Victoria, she asked softly, why did you risk your relationship with your son for me? Because some things matter more than blood, I answered. Character matters more than biology. 18 months of watching how people treat vulnerable family members showed me exactly who deserved support and who deserved consequences. Some mothers eventually discover that their adult children need expensive lessons about respect, empathy, and the difference between inheriting wealth and earning it through character. David was about to learn whether he was capable of genuine change or whether entitlement mattered more to him than family. 3 days passed without any word from David. Kezia, however, received several angry texts demanding that she convince me to reverse this insanity before she destroys our family permanently. During those days, I taught Kezia about property management. We reviewed tenant agreements, discussed maintenance procedures, and I introduced her to the contractors and service providers who kept the buildings running smoothly. Victoria, Kezia said as we reviewed the monthly financial statements, the rental income from these properties is more money than I've ever seen in my life. You'll learn to manage it responsibly, I told her. Money is a tool for security and independence, not just luxury. I want you to understand that you never again have to depend on someone else's approval for basic survival. What if I make mistakes with business decisions? You'll learn from them like everyone does. But I've watched you manage household finances, medical schedules, and multiple jobs with perfect organization. You have excellent judgment. On Thursday evening, David finally returned. He looked like someone who had spent days drinking and venting to friends who reinforced his victimhood instead of challenging it. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking. I want to propose a compromise." "What kind of compromise?" "You reverse the property transfers to Kasia, and I'll agree to marriage counseling to address how I've been treating her." I studied him carefully. "David, what makes you think those transfers are negotiable?" "They were impulsive decisions made from emotion, not rational financial planning. My decision was based on 18 months of observing character and 3 months of careful consideration while recovering in Europe. That's the opposite of impulsive. You can't seriously give a foreign daughter-in-law more inheritance than your own son." "Kasia isn't foreign anymore," I said evenly. "She's an American citizen who owns substantial property, and she didn't inherit anything. She earned it through exceptional care and loyalty." That word, foreign, revealed something deeper than financial resentment. "I'm willing to work on treating Kasia better," David said. "But only if you're reasonable about family finances. You're still trying to negotiate consequences as though an apology erases abuse." "I never abused anyone." "You forced someone to sleep in a garage and stole her wages under false pretenses. In most jurisdictions, that qualifies as domestic abuse and theft." Kasia stepped in from the kitchen, her posture straighter than I had ever seen before. "David," she said, "I want to talk about our marriage and what needs to change. We can work through this if Mom stops manipulating finances." "The properties are not manipulation," Kasia said firmly. "They recognize 18 months of care I provided. You did that because you're my wife." "Wives do not sleep in garages," Kasia replied. "Wives do not work multiple jobs to pay fictional debts while husbands spend money on entertainment." David stared at her, shocked. He had expected submission. "You're letting Mom turn you against me." "I'm not against you," Kasia said. "But I won't return to living like a servant while you treat me like a burden." "I never said you were a burden. You said I was irritating. You said I didn't deserve a real bedroom. You said I needed to learn my place as a foreign wife in an American family." Silence. "Even if I was harsh," David said finally, "that doesn't justify Mom giving away my inheritance." "The inheritance was never guaranteed," I said. "You assumed it. You never asked what you needed to do to earn it. Sons shouldn't have to earn inheritance." "Why not? Why is biology more important than character?" "That's how families work." "No," I said. "Love doesn't excuse cruelty. Blood doesn't cancel accountability. So I have to earn back my inheritance?" "Inheritance is a gift. Gifts go to people who demonstrate dignity and responsibility. And you think Kasia deserves it more than me?" "I think she proved her character for 18 months. You proved yours in 3. David sat quietly, absorbing the fact that his assumptions were permanently undone. "What do I need to do to prove I've changed?" "You treat Kasia as an equal partner. You contribute to household labor. You respect her financial independence. And then, I may consider additional inheritance provisions over time. But Kasia's property is permanent, regardless of your behavior." Some sons needed to learn that family wasn't hierarchy. It was mutual respect. 2 weeks later, David attempted change. Kasia moved into the guest bedroom, shared meals again, and managed her properties with quiet confidence. "Victoria," she said one morning, "a tenant reported heating issues in Building 2. I scheduled repairs and offered a rent reduction." Excellent judgment. David, meanwhile, performed helpfulness like a presentation. "I bought groceries," he announced. "I cleaned the bathroom. I started laundry." "Thank you," Kasia replied politely. At dinner I asked, "What's been hardest about this adjustment?" David hesitated. "I feel replaced. Kasia has financial power now." "That wasn't the plan." "What plan?" "Husbands provide. Wives support." "That only works," Kasia said calmly, "if husbands actually provide. You didn't." "I was managing resources." You were stealing my money while lying to me. David had no answer. That is not leadership or provision. That is exploitation. David's face reddened as he was confronted with an accurate description of his behavior, spoken by someone he could no longer intimidate or control. I made mistakes during a stressful period, he said. But I'm trying to change and be a better husband. David, I asked, what does being a better husband look like to you? Supporting Keisha's business success, sharing household responsibilities, and treating her as an equal partner rather than expecting her to handle everything domestically. Those sound like appropriate goals. How confident are you about sustaining those changes? David was quiet for several minutes, apparently struggling with honest self-assessment about his capacity for permanent behavioral change. I'm confident about wanting to change, he said finally. I'm less confident about whether I can permanently adjust to marriage dynamics where my wife has more financial power than I do. I appreciated David's honesty, even though his concerns revealed attitudes about gender and power that still needed examination. What would help you feel more comfortable with Keisha's financial independence? I asked. Honestly, knowing that I still have a meaningful role in our family, and that my mother still values our relationship despite my mistakes. Your role in the family is defined by your choices and behavior, I said. And my valuation of our relationship depends on your character development, not your gender anxieties. Over the following week, I observed David's continued efforts to demonstrate reformed behavior, while Keisha grew increasingly confident in her property management role. The contrast was striking. David was performing change. Keisha was growing into power. Victoria, Keisha said during one of our property inspections, I want to ask you something personal. Do you think David's behavior changes are genuine? Or is he just trying to convince you to restore his inheritance? What do you think, Keisha? I asked. I think David is trying to be a better husband, she said slowly. But his motivation is still mostly about financial consequences rather than understanding why his behavior was wrong. And how does that make you feel about your marriage? I feel grateful to have options now. If David can't genuinely change his attitudes about my place in the family, I can afford to live independently and build a life that respects my dignity. Is that what you want, independence from David? I want a marriage with mutual respect and partnership, Keisha replied. But I will not return to accepting treatment that makes me feel like a servant or a burden. I realized then that the most important outcome of transferring property to Keisha wasn't punishing David. It was giving her power, the power to demand respectful treatment and to leave if that respect couldn't be sustained. Keisha, I said, regardless of what happens with David, you have family support and financial security. You're not trapped by immigration concerns or economic dependence anymore. I know, she said quietly, and that knowledge makes me strong enough to insist on a marriage that honors my dignity rather than accepting whatever treatment David chooses to give me. Some gifts were more than financial transfers. They were grants of power, power that allowed vulnerable people to demand respect and leave situations that didn't provide it. Keisha was learning to use her independence not merely to escape abuse, but to negotiate better treatment. 6 months after the property transfers, I was reviewing quarterly rental income reports with Keisha when David requested a family meeting to discuss long-term arrangements and relationship expectations. His behavior over the past months had been consistently respectful, though it still carried the calculated quality of someone managing impressions rather than experiencing full internal transformation. Victoria, David said as we gathered in the living room that had hosted so many difficult conversations, I think we need to discuss where our family relationships stand and what my future looks like. What specifically do you want to discuss? I want to know if my 6 months of improved behavior have earned any consideration for restoring part of my inheritance. And I want to understand what Keisha and I need to do to rebuild our marriage on sustainable terms. I noticed that David was still framing the conversation around what he might earn back, rather than expressing genuine understanding of why his behavior had been unacceptable. David, I asked, what have you learned about marriage and family relationships during these past 6 months? I've learned that treating family members poorly has serious consequences, he said, and that wives deserve respect and partnership rather than subordinate roles. And what have you learned about yourself? David paused, weighing how much self-awareness he was willing to reveal. I've learned that I had unrealistic expectations about inheriting wealth without earning it, he said, and that I used traditional gender roles to justify treating Kasia unfairly when she was vulnerable. Those are important recognitions. Do you believe your behavioral changes are permanent? Or are you performing reform to regain financial advantages? I think my changes started as performance, David admitted, but they've become more genuine over time. Living with Kasia as an equal partner has been better for our marriage than the controlling dynamic I created before. Kasia, who had been listening carefully, joined the conversation with the confidence that 6 months of successful property management had given her. David, she said, I want to tell you how I experience our relationship now compared to before Victoria gave me independence. I'd like to hear that, he said. Before, I felt like a guest in the family, someone who had to earn the right to stay through work and compliance. Now I feel like a family member whose opinions matter and whose contributions are valued. And how do you feel about me specifically? David asked. I feel like you are trying to be a better husband, Kasia replied. But I also feel that you still see my financial independence as a temporary situation rather than a permanent change in our marriage dynamics. David's expression suggested she had identified something he'd hoped would go unnoticed. What makes you think I see your independence as temporary? Because you keep asking Victoria about restoring your inheritance, Kasia said calmly, as if the goal is returning to a previous arrangement where you control family finances and I depend on your approval for security. I don't want to control you, David said quickly. I just want to feel like I have a meaningful role in our family's financial future. You can have a meaningful role, Kasia replied, through your own career success and your own contributions, not through my dependence. But David, you cannot have a role that requires reducing my independence or my property ownership. I felt proud listening to Kasia articulate boundaries that protected her newfound power, while still offering David the possibility of partnership, one that did not depend on her subordination. Kasia, I asked, what would a sustainable marriage look like to you? A marriage where we both contribute according to our abilities, she said calmly, where financial decisions are made together, but neither person can control the other's security, and where cultural differences are respected, not used to justify unequal treatment. I turned to my son. David, what would sustainable marriage look like to you? A marriage where we're both contributing to the family's success, he said after a pause, and where I feel like a valued partner, rather than someone whose role has been eliminated by Mom's financial intervention. I realized then that David was still struggling with feeling replaced, rather than understanding that true partnership meant both people having power and independence. David, I asked gently, why do you feel your role has been eliminated rather than enhanced by having a financially successful wife? Because traditional marriage roles gave me a clear identity as provider and leader, he admitted. Now Kasia has more financial resources than I do, and that makes my contribution feel less essential. What if your contribution was based on character and partnership, rather than financial dominance? I asked. I'm trying to learn how that works, he said honestly, but it's challenging to adjust to marriage dynamics I wasn't prepared for. After David left for work, Kasia and I continued our conversation about family relationships and future planning. Victoria, she said, I want to ask you something important. David keeps asking about his inheritance, but I want to know about my responsibilities to this family. What do you mean? I asked. You've given me substantial wealth and opportunity, she said thoughtfully. What do you expect from me in terms of family care and relationship maintenance? I realized Kasia wasn't thinking in terms of entitlement, but of reciprocal obligation. Kasia, I asked, what responsibilities do you think you have? I think I should contribute to your care as you age, support family relationships when possible, and use the wealth you've given me in ways that honor your values and generosity. That sounds appropriate, I said. What values do you want your wealth to reflect? Helping people who are vulnerable, she replied. Supporting family members who demonstrate good character, and building security that doesn't depend on other people's approval or control. And how do you see your relationship with David developing? I hope David can genuinely accept a marriage with a financially independent wife, she said. But I will not sacrifice my security or dignity to make him comfortable with traditional gender roles. And if David cannot adjust, then I will end the marriage, she said without hesitation, "and build a life that respects my worth and capabilities." She met my eyes. Having options means I can insist on the treatment I deserve rather than accepting whatever David chooses to give me. That evening, I made a decision about David's inheritance that reflected both his progress and his remaining limitations. "David," I said, "I've decided to restore part of your inheritance based on your behavioral improvements over the past 6 months. "Really?" he asked. "How much?" "I'm naming you beneficiary of 2 rental properties and $200,000 in investment accounts. However, Kaya remains the primary beneficiary of my estate, and her current property ownership is permanent." "That's less than I expected," he admitted, "but more than I was afraid I might receive. Your inheritance reflects demonstrated character improvement," I told him. Balanced against the seriousness of your previous behavior. Future considerations will depend on sustained respectful treatment of family members." "I understand," David said quietly, "and I'm grateful for the opportunity to earn back family trust. Some sons needed expensive lessons about character, respect, and the difference between inheriting wealth and earning it through demonstrated values." 2 years later, 2 years after the night I found Kaya sleeping in my garage, I sat in my attorney's conference room finalizing the last details of my estate plan. The woman across from me was no longer the frightened, exhausted daughter-in-law who had worked multiple jobs to survive my son's psychological abuse. Kaya was now a confident businesswoman. She managed 7 properties, employed 3 maintenance staff members, and had become one of the most respected landlords in the county. "Victoria," she said, reviewing her quarterly report, "the tenants in Building 5 want to renew their leases for another 2 years. We have 0 vacancies across all properties." "That's exceptional management," I said. "Your attention to tenant satisfaction has created the kind of stability most property owners dream about. I learned by watching how you treated people, with respect and fairness," she said. "Good business comes from good character." David, now working as Kaya's business partner while maintaining his own job, was barely recognizable from the man who once justified forcing his wife to sleep on concrete floors. "Mom," he said, handing me organized insurance documents, "all 7 buildings are renewed. We've also identified 2 potential investment properties." "What kind?" "A small apartment complex near the university," Kaya explained. "It's well maintained but underperforming due to poor management. We think better communication and responsive maintenance could improve tenant satisfaction and income." Watching them work together, I felt proud. David handled. "And Victoria, I want you to know that I will use the wealth you've given me to help other vulnerable people, and to maintain the values you've taught me about treating everyone with dignity." Kasha added, "What values have I taught you?" "That family is created through loyalty and care, not just biology. That wealth should be earned through character, and used to protect people who need support. That respect has to be demonstrated consistently, not just promised during a crisis." I looked at these 2 people, my son, who had learned expensive lessons about humility and respect, and my daughter-in-law, who had transformed from a victim into a confident leader, and I realized that our family had been rebuilt on stronger foundations than it had ever possessed before. My son had once believed that sleeping in my bed while forcing his wife to sleep in the garage was appropriate household management. He discovered that some mothers reward loyalty over biology, that inheritance is earned through character rather than guaranteed through birth, and that abusing vulnerable family members has consequences that permanently change family relationships. But most importantly, he learned that treating people with dignity creates stronger families than controlling them through fear and dependency. At 76, I was no longer just a stroke survivor or a woman whose son had disappointed her. I was Victoria Sterling, a family matriarch who had used wealth strategically to teach lessons about character, protect vulnerable people from abuse, and create incentives for respectful relationships that honored everyone's dignity and potential. Some lessons about love and respect required dramatic interventions that permanently altered family dynamics. But when those interventions produced genuine character development and healthier relationships, they became the foundation for family legacies. Built on justice rather than biology alone, David and Kazia had learned that families function best when everyone has power, security, and options. and when love is demonstrated through actions that honor each person's inherent worth. The end.